Hi, we're Oxygen Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions.
Richard, welcome to the Shoot Room.
Thank you for having me. Very exciting.
Can you tell people who you are and what you do?
So I'm Richard Benwell. I'm Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link, which probably most people have never heard of. We're a small charity that looks after lots of big charities. So we're a coalition of 86 now environmental charities thinking about wildlife, animal welfare, and human health and well-being and the natural environment.
Amazing. So I'm fascinated in this question. Can you take us back to your childhood? Take us from your origin story. What are the chapters of your book that go from where you started to where you are today?
Oh, that's a humongous question, and I'll keep it brief.
Please don't. We're here to tell your story. Give us all the twists and turns and the...
Well, I'm from Birmingham by background, so a city boy. I still love that city. It's one that's filled with great people and little corners of great wildlife. And, while I was there, I got lucky enough to go to a school where you could go to a Friday afternoon option that was bird watching. So every Friday afternoon I tootled down to the lake that was by the school, and with a very wonderful teacher who'd been a ranger, counted birds, and...
What was the school?
It was called King Edward's,
Okay.
so it was just outside the centre of Birmingham.
My wife taught in Birmingham for a while at the consortium of schools. So yeah,
Very good.
and I should say shout out to Delia and Lisa at Birmingham Wildlife Trust because they both visited. So
Excellent.
shout out to them.
And my twin brother works for Birmingham Wildlife Trust.
Oh really?
Yep. He does their social media stuff.
Wow.
So he is also a wildlife enthusiast and making sure that Birmingham stays green.
For the same reason? Did he have the same school, same connection?
Yeah, James also did Friday afternoon birding for a bit. He sort of went off and did different things for a while. He checked out the law for a bit. He thought about different things, but it was obviously in his heart somewhere. And we were talking before we started recording about internship programs. James joined the Wildlife Trust's internship program that was there to offer routes into the sector for people from different backgrounds and who might not have sort of conventional degrees and what have you. And it just changed his life. I don't think he'd mind me saying that he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do. And one of the things that we often tell politicians as nature advocates is that this is a subject that can heal hearts, save lives, improve people's health and well-being. And I think it's just transformed my brother's life coming into the wildlife sector and rediscovering the joys of wildlife photography and leading groups of people around Birmingham's nature. And it's been wonderful for him. And I think he's doing amazing work for wildlife in Birmingham. So, that's my little tale of how this can really be true and how those internship programs, hey guys, are fantastic ways that can really, really save lives, frankly.
What a lovely story. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we're birding on a Friday. Take us on.
Yeah, so after that, people off to university to do history, because I also like knights in armour and a bit of medieval fun. So 3 years of history at university.
Whereabouts did you go?
Went to Cambridge, stuck around there for years and years, because what a great life that was.
Did you enjoy your time there?
I loved it.
Yeah.
Loved it. I mean, it's not for everyone, but it was such a treat to
What did you love?
Cambridge. All the things.
All the time.
I mean, it was super studying with such gigantic, enormous brains, and there was, it was one of those places where you could do everything around the study as well. So, singing and dancing and clubs of every kind. So it was just a wonderful place to be for me. But I stuck around and did a PhD eventually on how to design a carbon market that works, with a brilliant guy in the Faculty of Law, Marcus Gehring, who's an international trade lawyer. And from there to the civil service for a couple of years. So I took the
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, that was brilliant too, in a different way again. I'm sorry, I'm being endlessly enthusiastic.
No,
but
I
it
love
was.
it. Keep it going. Keep it
It
going.
was. If you don't know it, there's sort of there's this thingamajig called the Fast Stream, which is a recruitment scheme for new graduates. I joined that and took the parliamentary option and ended up being a clerk for the Energy and Climate Change Committee. And the clerks eventually transmogrify into those mad-haired, silly-wigged, betighted people with swords and robes in the chamber who
You just wanted the sword.
it was playing on the whole medieval fun.
Yeah.
But while you're a mini clerk, a baby clerk, you look after select committees and help members understand how Parliament works, and the clerks are the sort of guardians of democracy, really, if that's not too grandiose. But while you're a little one, you help parliamentarians to do their committee work. So you help guide them with the questions to ask, you help draft the reports. And I was with the Energy and Climate Change Committee with Tim Yeo, and we had a really good time doing electricity market reform. And what else did we do? We did inquiries on supergrid and offshore oil and gas. So a couple of great years with the select committee, but that reminded me where I wanted to go. So I went off to the RSPB, and since then it's been
before we leave your
all the fun
parliamentary
sector.
time. So externally, often people can perceive the pace of change is incredibly slow and things don't move forward. Did it feel that way being in the heart of it?
Well, being a clerk isn't quite being in the heart of it. It's very different from government. If you imagine, obviously the bits of that world of Whitehall, there's the civil service that lives on Whitehall, where the civil servants are squirreling away doing their massively in-depth, information-driven planning, and it's a machine that grinds on regardless of the politics.
Yeah.
Then you've got the parliamentarians themselves, who are such a variety, looking for championing what they can do for their local constituency, or looking for their niche in national politics, and trying to find a voice. And you've got government, obviously, with the great departments and the ministers who are actually making decisions. But then the clerks, the House of Commons service and the House of Lords service themselves, they're different again. They've been there since the dawn of time, and they've not changed at all in some ways. It's a place where every night the clerks would go to the reading, and you'd take these great tomes of the formal record of the House's business, and the baby clerks would read it to the senior clerks there in their great ornamental gear, and you'd read it word by word to check that every nuance of procedure had been correctly recorded. So it was the heart of democracy, making sure that the procedures are followed properly, and that Parliament works well. But it's a very different world from, say, DEFRA or the Home Office or one of the great decision-making departments, where the fast pace of change and submissions going up and decisions coming down, it's a different world from that. It's almost a time capsule from 1752 or whatever.
Did you watch Yes Minister when you were younger?
I did, yeah. I mean, when did I watch Yes Minister? Probably in my sixth form type time.
I adored it. So in terms of the language, the play on with the playful nature of it, is that what it felt like when you were working close to government?
I mean, it was later on I actually became a civil servant. So after time with RSPB and WWT, I went in to be a civil servant, working for Michael Gove as his environment advisor. And there I could see the echoes of Yes Minister. Definitely there are, well, what do I think about the civil service? The civil service is fantastic. The amount of information that's available in the civil service compared with what we work in outside is just mind-blowing. I think sometimes in the environmental sector, we think we know stuff, and then you walk into government and see what's going up to the Secretary of State every day, and just the amount of stuff and the level of professionalism in the way it's presented, and the detail and the analysis is fabulous. But there is also an inherent risk aversion in the civil service where everything that goes up to decision makers is wrapped around with questions of legal risk and financial risk. And sometimes it felt that those questions were driving decision making much more than they ought to, and much more than the questions of the risk of planetary doom, for example. And it's in the expressions of that kind of risk that you could see Sir Humphrey. So it's when you've got a brilliant suggestion for how the law could be improved or how a decision could go to improve the state of the world, and then a certain tone would enter the voice of,
This is a
but of
British
course,
democracy,
Minister.
Bernard.
Yes, exactly. But of course, Minister, we must consider the legal risk around this, and imagine the chances of judicial review were you to take this decision that might save the world, but might open you up to legal risk. And there were echoes of that occasionally. Through it, one of my favourite things to do as a civil servant, lucky enough to be able to talk directly to the Secretary of State, was to find those civil servants who'd been harbouring a brilliant idea and had a little flame tucked away that had been sort of cloaked in Humphreyism.
I mean, there was literally an episode where they keep the minister away from that guy. And literally, like, don't let him go walk about in case he finds the people with ideas.
Well, that's what I like to do. Go and free them from Humphreyism and get the ideas out.
I think people misunderstand the purpose of the civil service. I think people think it's there to do things, and it isn't. It's there to maintain the status quo and make sure mistakes aren't made. You can't ask it to be innovative. Because in a business, if you're innovative and you create something and you generate a profit and wealth, you can reinvest that into your business, you can save it for the future, you can make decisions. You can't in the public sector. There is no mechanism for significant success. There's only a measure of failure. So in a world whereby you can't, the cricket analogy, why would you try and aim for the boundary if the six doesn't count? You can lose your wicket. And I think that was my experience of the civil service, that it was just, you're not allowed to fail. It wasn't an environment where failure was accepted, never mind encouraged. So asking it to be innovative is just asking for something it's not meant to do. It's meant to be there in 100 years for government to be largely the same and maintain the status quo, irregardless of the political comings and goings.
Yeah, there is that sense of a sort of balancing ballast on ministerial ambition. But, if you have a clear direction of travel from a minister and an expression of intent, then, the civil service machine is meant to follow it. And when there's a really effective Secretary of State or minister in place, you can see
the key
machine
word in that sentence, right? Meant.
Yeah, well, exactly. And sometimes the weight of the ballast was too heavy, and the culture of risk aversion can weigh down a well-meaning minister.
So we're recording this in late October, and we had George Eustace in a couple of weeks ago. So I think we probably will release these in order. George was wonderful, expressing that exact frustration and feeling that he was like, so I was an executive in the public sector while George was in DEFRA. And it was wonderful to reflect on things that he tried to open up, and I could share how that had ended up on the ground. And the connect between the two was very difficult. So I was fortunate to again be a director at the EA when Michael Gove was Environment Secretary. So how long were you with Michael for?
I suppose it was around 2 years.
Yeah. What was that like?
It was brilliant. Oh no, I'm using the word brilliant constantly.
Well, I will with him as well. So I thought he was brilliant, and the most impressive politician I've met and worked with. And I think because how successful and like verging on innovative he was, is why he wasn't in the department too long. He made it too big a role, and there was a risk of it overshadowing other people. He's the only politician of that caliber I've met who genuinely listened to understand. And everyone he met, I heard him ask questions and literally listen to them. The vast majority of others ask questions to respond, and it was all about the touch point and the being seen to announce something, whereas he was genuinely thoughtful and fast-paced, and I love my time working with him when he came to the area. So yeah, your reflections would be wonderful too.
Well, I think you've characterised it really well. He was a very thoughtful man in both ways. So he considered questions very deeply and effectively, and he was also a kind leader. I'm sure we don't agree on everything, but we talk
Life wouldn't be
about
interesting
the
if we did,
environment. He brought me in to work on the Environment Act, and in the end, the Agriculture Act and the Fisheries Act with it, he was really, really ambitious to change DEFRA's status within Whitehall and to achieve real environmental improvements. I'm tremendously proud of what we got through with the Environment Act. It could, of course, have been stronger. And the reason it came in, we needed an Environment Act for a decade. We needed an act to set legally binding targets for nature and to help drive investment and start spatially mapping where that should happen. But the eventual midwife of the Environment Act was Brexit, and the risk that we would lose the power to enforce environmental law. We'd lose that direction of travel for environmental recovery that came from European Commission. And so what we created with the Environment Act had both the features of what we always needed, that strong direction of travel and process for getting investment in nature. But it also had to do such a lot of heavy lifting to replace what was being lost because of leaving the European Union and the importance of the European Commission in courts for environmental protection, regardless of what you think about Brexit. That was undoubtedly, it was a really important factor in environmental law here in the UK. Because of that and that double role for the Environment Act, I think it maybe didn't get as far as it should have done. But it was brilliant working with Mr. Gove, and as much of the problem of getting ambitious things through that comes with the civil service is also, of course, getting stuff through other departments. That's the other bit that's really, really tricky.
George
He was a
reflected
master of it.
on that and saying how brutal that process was. Yeah.
The horrors of right round, and it's so frustrating because every department has its own priorities, which you'll see carved into everything that you try to get through, and then above that, the demands of spending and legal risk reduction sort of are a further weight that comes again through right round. So that process of trying to get the whole of government to agree is a second anchor on ambition.
Isn't possible. Consensus isn't possible. It's one of the reasons why in the sector as a whole, there's lots of fairy tales and sort of moral positions that people would love to advocate and like. So one of those, I think, is public ownership of land. So it's a lovely thing and a great idea. Someone has to pay for it and someone has to make decisions. Where I've spoken to groups who have done community buyouts and things like that, if you talk to them honestly, they're like, it's an absolute nightmare because no one will decide. And you get stuck in inertia and in terms of a decision making. All you need to do is think about asking your family what they might like for dinner. So my wife and 2 children, I get 3 different answers. I have tried to ask communities what we should do with a landscape. You get 1,000 different answers, and they're often diametrically opposed. So that leaves you sat nowhere. So when you're trying to seek consensus, all you do is get the average, and that ends up being no one likes it. Everyone's dissatisfied with the perspective. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Well, you've just taken a glimpse into the world of Wildlife and Countryside Link, where we try to get 86 organisations to agree, and so often with coalitions, you just get to the consensus of flab and nothing.
Yeah.
We try to create a space where everybody can be braver than they would be individually. But just to pick up on what your example there of where it works with land, it's really interesting, isn't it? That there's this idea that community ownership is can solve everything. Sometimes communities don't want to. We see it with water company assets, don't we, where there's an expectation of building in environmental aspects to a new development, and as soon as they can be farmed off to somebody else to manage, the better. And sometimes companies try to foist things on communities that don't stand a chance really of managing your suds or your what's meant to be a wildflower meadow or whatever, because people have got other things going on in their lives. And
Yeah, there's
organise
the
things like that.
presupposition that everyone cares. So we were doing a project in one area and we were told, well, you need to knock on every door and ask people what they think. I'm like, how is it my place to impose on someone and presume they care that we'd like to plant some trees 20 minutes away?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting perspective. So we try and we have the podcast, we write a huge amount, we publish a lot to say, we'd welcome your views if you would like to share them, but it's no obligation to. I have no interest in running for Parliament or standing on doorsteps and being an MP, although it strikes me you might.
Not anymore, I don't think.
Oh, interesting. At one point you thought you might?
Well, I did have a go.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to tell that story.
Well, let me just. I think just before we go to that,
Go ahead.
maybe by mentioning that example of community ownership of assets and whatever, sounding like I didn't think that's a good plan. Actually, I do think there's. Maybe we'll disagree. I think there's a huge potential for community involvement, public ownership, and maybe in particular more recognition of public interest in privately held land than there is at the moment. So we're just doing the local nature recovery strategies. I'm looking after the local nature partnership in Oxfordshire, and there's huge enthusiasm from people to get stuck in on that. People love the process of being able to say, here's what we've got now, what would we like the future to be, where's the potential for better, and it's been really, really inspiring. Of course, you get mostly the usual suspects, people whose day job it is to be involved, or people who've got a stake, but there's also lots of people who just think that they'd like to take an interest in the place that they live.
How do you square the circle in that scenario where, what if person X who lives next door wants it to be a skate park or wants it to be a car park? Why is their view not as relevant as the person who wants it to be a wildflower meadow?
Well, of course it is, and that's the great challenge of the land these days, that we've got more wants than we've got space to do them in, and there are processes for balancing those trade-offs, ranging from hopefully the new land use framework will help us to.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Sort that out? The land use framework, I think it could be if they do it right.
Do you think they will do it right? Well, sorry, that's the unfair question. Is it possible to do it right?
Yes, well, it's possible to do better than we do at the moment, which is just ignore the problem entirely and have a national system and a very local system and nothing to
Increasingly, I
the
think
gap.
when people have tried to do things at that scale, the complexity is virtually impossible because things are so nuanced when you get to a community, a place, a road, a street, a relationship. When you look at things at scale, you just end up with such a blunt instrument. So if you look at things like the James Hutton Institute of Land Classification, that was someone in the 70s driving around fields looking over hedge and going, yeah, looks like a 1, looks like a 2, looks like a 3. We've now got a land use approach that's wedded to those things that have no current bearing on reality. We have data sets that are just so much more sophisticated than were then, but to repeat that process is so challenging and difficult. I don't know. I think I tend to think market-based mechanisms are more of a agile way of dealing with these things. Even with the public ownership type of stuff, I think that situation you described in Oxford sounds awesome and is exactly where we should be aiming at, as long as that group has the ability to deliver the changes it wants. So if it doesn't have the financial ability to improve things, because everything costs something, whether it's small, medium, or large, in the absence of that, and that can't be government funding because it's just not there. In the absence of that, it's just a wish list.
Yeah. That's where you have to marry the two up. I mean, for me, on the land use framework, I think part of the magic will be about being able to express the need for change major changes with more parity than we have at the moment. So we have a planning system that will be once again driven by housing number targets, which will drive decisions towards.
I mean, they're largely irrelevant targets, though, aren't they? Because no one's hit them ever.
Well, but they do drive lots of decisions at the local level. You know, if you haven't got your apportionment of land, then you have a presumption of sustainable development, and things go through without without the sort of local decision making that you'd get if you had an agreed local plan with.
So just on that point, what does local mean to you?
Well, I'm referring now to the administrative level of local plans, really. So I suppose local authority level.
So it's a really, we get that a lot. We get asked, what do local people think? I know, I say, fantastic question. Could you help me understand what you mean by local? And we get definitions of everything from your immediate neighbours to anyone who's ever been to a place or thinks they might, which is quite a difficult one to consult with. Have you thought about going to a place? Well, you've now mentioned it. So yes, can you please consult with me? So I think that's one of our challenges that we've had is we'd love to consult with who people mean, but finding them is quite challenging sometimes.
Well, and again, people mainly interact with the system to oppose things.
They do, yeah.
It's because we've only all got so much life. You sort of allocate your time as to where you see risks. Again, we're a risk-averse type species, aren't we? And if you see something bad happening, you'll devote the time to try to stop it. But if you're asked to be part of something to improve things, it's a much harder sell.
Well, and definition of bad and improve varies so dramatically. You know, we've had people say, you need to plant more trees, you need to plant less trees, you need to manage deer numbers harder or not at all, you know, in the same conversation. So it's really difficult. That's why I'm back to you can't find consensus. You have to try and do the thing that and that's why there's a big responsibility being a landowner. But if we need to see the landscapes change to be better for wildlife and the environment, I think that's easier to do with a controlling voice that's open to opinions and perspectives from neighbouring communities and to experts, but someone has to make a decision and someone has to write a check or nothing changes. Where we have a scenario where someone has a local perspective and, for example, they might be a passionate sporting enthusiast and say, I think we should burn the lands, we should burn the hill so it's better for grass because I want to see that. As a private landowner, that doesn't fit our ambitions for the estate. We want to bring back nature. We want natural regeneration of woodland and restoration of what's there. How do I have that conversation? How do I broach that challenge and try and balance those things? Because that's the realities we face in listening to a small section of public opinion, wanting to be respectful about it, but it's so diametrically opposed to a better future for the environment. How do we help?
How do you help? Well, some things should be taken out of your hands. Burning in all but the most limited circumstances should be and is almost against the law, and it shouldn't be for communities to have that discussion amongst themselves. If something is so obviously bad for the biodiversity on the land, for the carbon sequestered in the peat, for the future of the world, that's where the law should step in to help you in exactly the same way that it shouldn't be up to every consumer to judge between products on the supermarket shelf as to whether they've been sustainably fished or whether they contain products that will end up being flushed down the drains and destroying our freshwater ecosystems. The law has a huge role to play there. When it comes to things around the edges, well, we talked about a little bit about markets earlier. I think that we're nowhere near where we should be in terms of stacking the odds against the bad stuff. And too often, the cheap choice is the one that is the worst for the world. And it ought to be that the most rewarding choices are the ones that pay best. And that would help.
That's absolutely our aspirations around natural capital and development of those markets. It's a really interesting point you mentioned about the role of the law and the things that shouldn't be in our hands. One of the things that surprised me when I started off on this journey, so Oxygen Conservation's a little over 3 years old now. I was surprised when we buy a new property, we'll try and have an open event and welcoming neighbours and anyone who wants to come and feed people and have a conversation about what they want. still get quite a lot of, but I want to fox hunt on your land.
Mm-hmm.
So something that is absolutely illegal, that doesn't mean people still don't think they've got a right or an obligation to do it, not an obligation, a right to do it on land that they don't own. And this is where I struggle with the public influence over the future of private land, because often these opinions are rooted in long-standing belief systems that have no future application within a landscape. So that's what's hard in the reality of delivering some of this stuff. And I've got a piece pending that is the difference between sort of wishes and fairy tales in the landscapes and the reality of delivering things. So discussions are a lot in Scotland at the moment about the role of fencing in landscape. So we don't want fencing, we want right to roam for people. Absolutely fine, I mean, you can put gates in, but we want better connected landscapes. I completely agree. But we also want trees to grow back, and there's far too many deer. Okay, great. You now need to control a huge amount of deer. But what if our neighbours, their businesses are predicated on sporting visitors and having deer?
Yeah.
That is a circle you cannot square.
Well, maybe a distinction to help through this is the difference between a public interest and a vested interest.
Oh, that's a great, yes, go explore that one.
So when I say that there ought to be more recognition of public interest in the land, what I'm thinking about is the legacy of that land for future generations and the role that land plays in a wider ecosystem. And so it's surely right that if you own land that harbours the last remaining pocket of an endemic species, that you bear some responsibility to look after that for the future, for the public good. And yes, you should be rewarded and helped with that, but you also have a responsibility that comes with it. And that will vary as to, the uniqueness of the asset. When I say, of course, that's distinct from a vested interest, the fact that you've been galloping your horses over a piece of land and killing things on it for a long time might be in your, might have cultural value for you. It might be in your narrow interest, but is it in the interests of future generations, in the interest of wider communities? Almost certainly not. And teasing those things out is a political decision, but it's one that has to be made.
There's no point of arbitration for that at the moment.
No.
Which is really hard. So one of my favourite ones of those is one estate in Scotland. We've got a very passionate gentleman who wants to drive his 4x4 across our estate. There are no tracks. There's no ability to do this safely. His argument is, well, I've got a right to roam. We appreciate that. You're very welcome. Please come and walk across the estate. No, you can't drive your 4x4 across this. Well, I want to. I'm local and I want to. From that gentleman's perspective, we are not respecting his rights as a local person to enjoy that landscape. People have very, very personally motivated vested interests.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the application of some of these things difficult, which comes back to my point about a land use framework that, yes, it can maybe capture 40 or 50% of scenarios, but then the delivery of that gets really complicated and difficult.
Yeah.
Which is where someone like you can come in. So take us to the day job. Take us to what the day job looks like and how I don't think I've met anyone in the sector who has the ability to find the level of consensus you do repeatedly. So how on earth do you make that work?
It doesn't always work, and sometimes we don't, but it's a really exciting job to be in. So for those who don't know, Wildlife and Countryside Link is there to try and do policy and legislation and spending on behalf of people like the National Trust and the RSPB on the one hand, through to folk like the mighty Wild Justice on the other hand. So there's quite a span of practice and opinion through there. And the way we try to navigate it is to find the best brains from within our sector and borrow and enhance their ideas, to always aspire to chop out the chaff. So coalition and consensus building often works by obfuscation. You just put so many things in that you're left with something that looks like it says something and in fact doesn't. So my little team tries to exercise the sword of choppiness and get rid of the rubbish.
Is it a Churchill quote? I'm sorry, it's so long I didn't have time to make it short.
Yeah, exactly. It's that thing. Exactly. But actually, sometimes we make it on purpose in order to hide the fact that we don't really have anything in there. So we try to get around that by chopping away. But mostly because we know that most people want to be brave most of the time. And so if we can try and offer a pointy edge that those guys can do collectively that they might not be able to do by themselves, usually we've managed to lead people through the trickier places. And
in that model, you're giving them so much support and comfort, and giving them their tribe, their crowd to be together with, to help give them the confidence to be braver, I think.
I hope so. And I think our movement has been growing up quite a lot lately. I think there used to be quite a lot of pointy elbows in movement, and a sense that whose badge and whose animal was, or oak leaf or badger or avocet or whatever the heck it was on the thing was most important, and that maybe there was a finite pie that everybody had to elbow for room
That's
from.
really interesting.
And I don't think that's the case anymore, though. I think this generation of leaders is more up for working together.
Yeah,
And that's
do you know what?
exciting.
I've said very similar. So we've kind of got parallel worlds that cross over. Mine is now veering more into the financial space as well as the environmental. I've described in the last 3 to 5 years, I felt a big pivot from the protectionist sort of almost internal competition in the environment sector, the very much the no, stay away, we do it differently here, to being far more collegiate. So it's really wonderful to hear that you're feeling the same thing as well. And I think it is a generational change, and I think it is the new talent that's entering the sector, and also the, you mentioned about the big brains. I think we've got people coming into the environment sector, some of which are in this room right now, that 5 years ago wouldn't have been in the sector. You know, we've got people with award-winning firsts out of top universities that would have gone to a big 4 consultancy firm or would have gone to the banks, who are now coming into the environment sector, which is just amazing. And that's what gives me the hope about the future. I mean, you blush slightly with how enthusiastic you are. I get accused of this a lot, but it's because of that talent that's coming through. It's super, super exciting. And are you getting that same sense of the talent entering the space as well?
Definitely. I mean, Link is only a small organisation, and we don't pay that much. So,
Which is still true of the sector in general, I think.
yeah, it is. It is. So it's hard to be competitive, and we get quite a number of our team straight from university. But my goodness, I've got an amazing team. There are some absolute superstars on there. Hi Matt, hi Emma, hi Ellie. I won't list them all. They're a lovely gang, and they're brilliant. They're absolutely fantastic, and could give a run for the money for anybody in Westminster, in Whitehall or whatever. And they've come because they care, and we can't rely on that. We have to keep beefing up our offer to make sure that, you know, we're not asking them to do things for nothing, but they are there to win it. And that's fantastic.
Even that's a change. So I published a piece in the last week or so about our intern program's live at the moment, and we'd stop. So in the advert, it quotes a salary for internship being paid, but we'd still get the questions, oh, is it paid? And I'd stop saying big headline, yes, this is paid, because, well, it's not a job if it's not paid, is it? It's volunteer work. And it struck me, we were up in Scotland when this sort of piece of feedback came through, the questions that come about being paid. I was like, there's no wonder the environment sector hasn't been an investable place in a real financial sense, because it wasn't even prepared to invest in itself. So if you're not prepared to pay talented people coming through, a financial institution, the significant scale of capital we need to welcome to the space to actually change the world just isn't going to flow. And it's striking really how recently the sector wanted people to work for nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, I had to volunteer to get sort of work in the sector and do other jobs to then do stuff environmentally. And it's so wonderful we're not in that position now. And actually we've moved away from that, because otherwise you aren't going to get the talent, you aren't going to get the diversity of experience and lived and opinion that you would otherwise. So hopefully we are on the start of the sort of great period of the environment sector, I hope.
This is part of its maturation, really, and I think it's wonderful actually that we did grow out of a volunteering sector.
It did some fantastic things, and all the trusts are amazing organisations, and we still need them, and they're wonderful. But I think they've done enough heavy lifting. We need commercial organisations to do their fair share now.
Well, I mean, the guys who still go out and do, you know, the wetland bird count and get down with their transepts as volunteers, that is such an amazing legacy of citizen scientists.
Yeah.
And, you know, we would not be in the situation we are now where we're able to properly hold the water companies to account had it not been for citizen science and people getting out there with their test tubes to check and test and reveal. You know, there's still that importance of the sort of volunteer expert that I hope will always be true. But because the sector grew out of a lot of that, where, you know, I love the stories of people in the RSPB headquarters getting birds in bags to autopsy on the tables in the lodge, you know, and, you know, just making it up as they went along. It's just taken a while to mature into a professionalized sector. And I hope that where we will go next is to, yes, think about how to take more money from the private sector, build nature into the economy in a way that hasn't before. But also, I hope that the next levels of growth for the sector will be really to nail the one or two big things that we want to campaign on and change together, because I think we have sometimes a failing of self-belief in our sector that we can change the really big stuff, and changing the way the markets work and changing the way that the private sector interacts with our natural environment is exactly one of those. And it's going to take the whole movement speaking together with one really strong voice to campaign for the kinds of legal economic change that we need to make this more than a fringe, and to move things forward as quickly as we need to. So yes, next stage, please. Let's borrow a leaf from the climate kids and choose one or two massive things that we believe we can change.
Nice. Which of the campaigns and which of the things that you've been involved with give you the most pride? What are you most happy that you've been able to influence or adjust or move forward?
I mean, the one that I suppose I'm most proud of is having a legally binding target to halt the decline of species abundance. That's one I'd been nobbling on about for years before the Environment Act. I remember well sitting with Rose Dickinson and Paul McNamee in the pub in Petit, France, when I was at the RSPB, saying, God, those climate guys are lucky having a legally binding target, aren't they? Look, it's getting things going. And, you know, that's when we first thought of the Nature and Wellbeing Bill, as it was called back then. And other people have been saying it too. And of course, oodles of folk have been involved with turning that sort of notion, which wasn't, after all, that surprising a conclusion to draw. But I feel like I've had at least a hand in taking that idea from its infancy in terms of a campaign building through RSPB and wildlife trusts, then creating the amendments in the European Union Withdrawal Act that required the government to bring forward legislative proposals to fill the governance gap from leaving the EU. I helped write that amendment with Matt Shardlow from BugLife. And then that opportunity turned into the sort of kernel of a bill that I was able to sort of shepherd through DEFRA. And when I first talked to the civil servants who were working on the Environment Act and said, this needs to have legally binding targets in it for nature in the same way as we have for climate, they laughed. It was very funny, but we got there. The Treasury eventually conceded. Mr. Gove did his thing of being a mighty leader in Whitehall. And, you know, yeah, I'm really proud to have played a little bit of a role alongside many others in getting that on the statute book, because hopefully it will help us to drive action in the next 5 years. And if it doesn't work, give us a big legal mallet to bash the government over the head with afterwards until they do something.
That's amazing. What makes a good environmental campaign? What makes one successful? What are the key ingredients?
For me, the most important ingredient is always knowing what the answer should be. So being able to express the change in the world that you want to see with enough specificity. And when it's stopping something, that's easy. If you don't want a road to be built, you just say, don't build that darned road. If you think that a major corporation is committing some environmental abomination, send them to jail, whatever it might be. But when it's changing things for the better, it's much harder to express the change you want to see with specificity and public appeal. So that for me is the core of everything. Combine with that, you need a good element of rage and passion and public opinion. But it's notable that where you have that without the answer, you can have years of very vocal campaigning without necessarily achieving much change. And then the third bit is a bit of luck. You need the opportunity, the decision point to hook your campaign to that enables you to make a difference. There are lots of things around that, of course. There are the brilliant advocates out there who are getting into the right corridors of power, and there are the campaigns and media strategies that go with it. But ultimately, the ingredients are know what you want to change, get some people rageful about it, and find your moment of turning point to turn the screw.
What are your big one or two, if we're sat here in pick your time period's time, what are the one or two you hope you had a big influence over moving forward?
It was really, really good working on the Agriculture Act in my DEFRA days. And that, I was working on the amazing opening that people like the National Trust and the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust had won by winning the concept of public money for public goods. But it was really fun trying to turn that into proposals for environmental land management. So you asked, what do I hope will go well?
You hope we get public money for public good.
I hope we get there. At the moment, the transition has... it's not gone half as far or as fast as I hoped it would, but there's a chance now for this Labour government to realise that if they want to hit their nature targets, they've got to work with farmers. We can't do it without farmers. If they want to get farmers there, they can't do it by deregulating, because if you just take away the legal foundations, you end up paying people for stuff they should have done anyway. And we're starting to see more and more money going to things that used to be in the law. And they've got to be really generous and really bold about the guys who do the most. And this is a sort of mini public version of the kind of market stuff that you're so good at. If you want to change a massive business sector like farming, then you're not going to do it by goodwill. You need to create incentives and excitement and be generous. And everybody knew that when we were going through the solar revolution and the wind revolution at the start, the feed-in tariffs weren't, they weren't at the market margin. They weren't sort of some economic ideal that, you were paying just enough to get the market rate. They were generous. People were making money because we needed to create a revolution. And that's what we need in the farmed environment too, so that the guys who really want to go the furthest are duly rewarded. Public money, I think, will still play a big role in that if Labour can get this right.
I think that's an epically brilliant point, and I've not heard it expressed as well as that before. The so many things that you mentioned there overlap. So one of my interesting things to explore with people recently has been the No Farmers, No Food campaign. I think there's an example of rage that's not asking for anything, because I'm yet to meet anyone who doesn't agree with that statement. Who thinks there should be no farmers? No one. I've not met a single person. And actually, a lot of the sort of a lot of farmers who I've spoken to, be it our neighbours or advisors in the sector, are like, it's such a terrible campaign that doesn't help us, because it's just yelling into a void. And whereas actually, I think what you've got with the current subsidy system is people clinging to the status quo at the cost of a better future for everybody. I remember being in a really early workshop on this hosted by DEFRA, and this amazing gentleman farmer stood up and said, sector's failing, we're doing terrible things. We need to move to recognise those farmers are doing the right thing for the environment, that are running really good businesses. We need to reward them more. Someone else at the table was like, I completely agree with you, and that'll see some of the other farms go along the way, but the better ones will prosper. And he was like, no, that's outrageous. We have to make sure they have currently what they have now. No one can go out of business with this, and we need to pay these other people more. So they wanted half the market mechanism, but a completely cushioned approach for those that weren't working in the same way. And I think it became an emotional argument rather than an economic or a logical or an environmental one. And I just think as long as we try and cling to that status quo, and actually we're at a point whereby we've forgotten what the word subsidy means. It means fixing a broken system. But if it's there forever, it's not, there's no way of it fixing that system. It's not going to get improved if you just patch it up. We need a fundamental overhaul of it. And I'm still hopeful Labour are going to do something that way. Are you hopeful of the Labour government?
Yes. I mean, the jury is out. It's a bit...
It's been a bumpy start, right?
It's been a bumpy, not so bad though on the nature side, but I was trying to think of the sort of polite way of saying that there's a yin and a yang to it. Maybe that's the polite way to say it. On the one hand, it's really good that they included restoring nature in the manifesto, that Mr. Reid has been out there showing his steel on the water companies. He's talking about 30 by 30, all those good things. And we have had more engagement from this Labour government and more cross-departmental engagement from them than for years over the last few weeks. So that's all good. There are, however, bits of the messaging, particularly from the top of the government, that do ring alarm bells. The stuff about if it stands in the way of building, we will get rid of it.
I saw a soundbite from you on social media, you doing a piece to camera on that, and I thought it was so eloquent in terms of how you lay it. Look, regulation in this regard isn't a barrier, it's an enabler if done in the right way.
That's right. And regulation is too easily vilified as a cost, when any sensible interpretation realizes that if you take that cost away from business, you impose it on somebody else.
The regulation isn't akin to a private landowner. So a private landowner isn't inherently a problem. The things that are talked about the problem are those landowners who lock gates and say, stay away. We believe people and wildlife should be welcome to an environment, but it doesn't mean everyone everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Regulation is an enabler if done well. Private land ownership, when done well, should be an enabler as well. It should help fund this. It should help facilitate stuff. Charlie Courtney, the Earl of Devon, speaks incredibly about this. So he has 3,000 acres in Devon. He has been subject to criminal damage of his property, his livestock being attacked, but still advocates for public access because it's the right thing to do, but would like landowners to have some support to make it possible and to protect them from the risk associated. And I think private landowners like Charlie, who's opened up his estate, has reformed that. I visited him earlier this week and he was telling the story about how the estate lost its marriage license because his father, before he passed away, wouldn't allow gay weddings on the estate. And it's the first thing Charlie changed when he came back in. So, he's reformed that estate and modernised and brought it forward and welcomed people in. That's an example of where a private landowner, like regulation, can be an enabler.
Yeah, totally. So some of those messages from Labour have been less in the right direction. And, we're not going to expect the Prime Minister to stand on a stage and talk at length about new interpretations of economic growth. Let's face it, governments have to talk about growing the economy, but this sort of single-minded focus on growth without realizing that it's nature that underpins all that growth does pose risks. And we wait to see what the planning reforms really say. We wait to see whether Labour are brave enough to take on the old-fashioned orthodoxy of land management and farming practice in the way that they need to. So the jury's out. They're saying lots of good words, and Mr. Reid seems to care. So I'm hopeful, but we don't know yet. Environmental Improvement Plan review is the boring, geeky bit of where hopefully they'll land some really good plans for change.
Amazing. I'm hopeful too. Richard, thank you so much for coming in. It's been an absolute joy having you visit. Please keep up the amazing work. You're one of a small handful of people who are being absolute amazing advocates for the sector and for the organisations that are making the sector. We wouldn't have made the progress we have as a wider group of environmental organisations if it wasn't for you and your team. So congratulations and thank you very much.
That's kind. Likewise. It's been brilliant. Thank you.